Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience. I was thinking about telling jokes, but I thought it would be better to wait. I'm Steve Erlanger. I'm with the New York Times. I don't need to introduce George Papandreou to any of you here. We first met when he was foreign minister, and I was trying to cover the Kosovo war from inside Serbia and Kosovo. And you played a very important role with in getting it resolved. But our theme today is the rise of Euroscepticism. And in a way, I want to ask you, do you feel, in a way, that Euroscepticism rose or began with the Greek crisis? Was that a big cause of upset, of anger at Brussels that spread here elsewhere?
Well, thank you, Steve, and welcome to Greece. And let me commend your work and New York Times for playing a very important role in keeping progressive thinking alive in the other side of the continent, in the US, where we do see important movements developing and I think influencing also European thinking, and many young, particularly women, diverse in many ways in their backgrounds, but very, very hopeful for the cause of social democracy and progressive politics. I think Greece was very emblematic of the crisis we have gone through. And the whole narrative around the problem, I think, did do a damage to the European project. I would say that, first of all, what developed was this sense that, yes, the Greeks are to blame, and of course we were to blame, and particularly a particular government that had blown up the deficit, but the ideas and the stereotypes that came out were damaging. Greeks are lazy, Greeks don't work, Greeks have too high pensions. Some did, not all. And most of this was not true.
But what about the way Brussels responded and the impact of that on the rest of the European Union?
Brussels, first of all, had a very, I would say, huge responsibility in not revealing the crisis or stopping the crisis in Greece before it actually hit the fan. And I, of course, had to deal with a huge deficit and the markets that then became very jittery, had already become jittery. I think the second point is that the way Brussels, and Brussels, of course, is not just Brussels, it's also the different member states. I think unluckily, the Commission was very weak and didn't really step up to deal with this issue, even when the crisis took place, and Germany took the lead. And then these stereotypes about Greeks were developed. And of course, and as I said, this was wrong. And according to OECD, we work the longest hours of any other European country. But that stereotype of blaming the lazy Greeks played into this populism and demagoguery in Europe. And it was basically, now if you're a German worker, or even in the eastern part or central part of Europe, and I dealt with this. For example, Slovakia didn't want to help us because they were saying, why should we help these rich and lazy countries? So you don't want to be in the same bed. You don't want to be bedfellows in this European family. Mm-hmm. Rather than looking at the deeper causes of why Greece had this problem, which some of them were internal causes, but then also why not looking and see why this was also a global problem of the markets becoming overly excited, overly aggressive, overly speculative.
But I mean, do you think that this was a big blow to even the idea of European solidarity? Because that's part of the Eurosceptical complaint, is that
yes.
solidarity is gone,
yes.
that it's meaningless, that,
well, once you start,
that big countries actually don't do it.
That's right. It was an easy narrative to say Greece is the problem, which Greece did have its problem. But when you say Greece is the problem, basically you're absconding. You're saying I don't have any responsibility. It's, you know, you have to pay for your own sins. So it became almost a religious thing that, you know, Greeks have to be punished. It was the underlying message.
Yeah.
You did wrong, you have to be punished. We were punished, and we still are paying for this. But
that was there.
And that undermined the concept of solidarity. What we should have had is said, okay, let's look at the real root causes, why this happened, what Europe has to do also, because this was not just a Greek problem. This was also a European problem. I mean, we saw the contagion. Until Draghi in 2012 came out and said, we as Europeans united will stop the speculation in the markets, Europe was going into full-blown contagion. So this was this was also a global problem of how the markets reacted to this.
Do you think Greece was kind of sacrificed on the altar of other countries' banks?
Well, partly yes, partly no. Obviously, there was a concern about the banking system, and the banking system possibly could have imploded. And that would have been bad for all of us. So on the one hand, we did have to look at the banking system not falling apart. On the other hand, I think there was, again, some games of speculation where some banks offloaded Greek bonds in order to avoid the haircut that then came on later on. But I think that is only part of the problem. I don't think that was the main problem. I think the main problem that if Europe had been very united, had dealt with this problem quickly in the markets. Let me just say something maybe not many people realize. 2 weeks before the crisis hit Greece, Dubai had a crisis, a sovereign debt crisis. And all the markets were jittery about Dubai. Well, the Emirates came in and said, don't worry, we are here. That did not happen with Greece.
Do you regret?
And that is what, and I just wanted to make one thing.
Go ahead.
I talked to many economists in the United States who had lived with debt crises in Latin America and other parts of the world. I remember talking to Volcker. He said, you know, there's a moral issue here, but in the United States, we will not deal with the moral issue. We first have to deal with the crisis first. We would have solved this in 2-3 days. Well, maybe that was a hyperbole, but we would have come in full force and then talk about the responsibilities. Now, we dragged this on, and that really cost. And it cost
a lot.
Greek people, it cost the Greek citizens, it cost the Greek economy,
Do you regret
and it also cost Europe.
Do you regret not going to the IMF yourself early? Or
I didn't, the IMF could not have helped us. I did have contact with Strauss-Kahn then. There was no way the IMF alone could have dealt with this. I was not in favor of the IMF getting involved. I was in favor of creating an EMF, a European Monetary Fund. But that was not what the Germans wanted.
And the ECB thought it was, you know, impolite that only poor people go to the IMF and that the euro would never do it.
That was part of it. Trichet was very much against the IMF. Sarkozy was very much against bringing in the IMF, maybe for political reasons, because Strauss-Kahn was a possible rival. That didn't end up that way, but that was a different reason.
Certainly didn't.
But I was saying, let's make this a European problem. But I think Angela Merkel was saying, well, if the EU Commission and Barroso weren't able to monitor Greece, maybe we need somebody to come in from outside, and maybe we need some more money, and maybe I also need somebody who is a little bit more objective on this issue. So she was really pushing for the IMF to come in.
Yeah, I mean, you're head of the
let me put it this way. I did not want money. I did not go as a prime minister for money for Greece. What I was asking, not only from Angela Merkel, but from others, was I want exactly what Draghi did later on. I want you to tell the markets, don't worry, Greece is making reforms. We were starting to make huge reforms in Greece already. And I was saying, I want you to go out in the markets, Angela Merkel, and say, you know, Greece is doing a good program. She was telling it to me privately. She was even saying that to her press, that when we started doing our major reforms early 2010, very good program. But she said the markets will understand. No, I said the markets will not understand unless you come out as Germany, with France and others, of course, but Germany in the lead, saying we support not only the Greek program, but Greece and its bonds, so that we could actually access the markets and wouldn't need possibly to go.
Which way down the road she finally did, I mean, and told her finance minister that Greece was going to stay in and not be kicked out.
Yes.
Right? But it took quite a long time.
Yes.
You're head of the Socialist International, and one of the things I'd like to do is look ahead toward the European elections coming up, which are in a way very confusing. So what is the problem with the center-left all over Europe?
Good question. I'll turn that around a little bit, but I'll get to center-left. And I would say the problem in Europe today, the Euroscepticism in Europe, the existential angst that Europe is going through, is because we don't have strong, thank you very much, Brother Andreas. You see, I have family support here. That's solidarity, you see. But if we had real social democratic policies in Europe, I think there would not be so much Euroscepticism. And I think what happened was that there are a number of issues. One, the socialists in Europe, many of the socialists in Europe, bought into the fact that globalization was great, and we didn't understand the discontents, as maybe Joe Stiglitz would call it, of globalization. And there were many problems of globalization. There are parts of our society that are being marginalized. There is the undermining of the social contract. And Europe, that was at the heart, and that still is the heart of what part of Europe is: democracy, social contract, freedom. But what happened was, just take a minute just to make a slight analysis of this, because it's sometimes complicated, but I try to make it as simple as possible. As I see it, the social contract is a contract between employers, capital, workers, and the state. And that's what the tradition of social democracy has been. It's been a compromise which allows for, yes, capitalism and profit-making, but a redistribution through pensions, through education, through health, through better environment, working standards, and so on. Taxes, obviously, which is a big issue too. Now, with globalization, and we felt that in Greece, capital moves out of the nation state. Capital has no country. And however good that might be for capitalists, it broke down the social contract. And it broke down in the developed world. In the developing and emerging markets, it actually brought capital there, and they were much more optimistic and so on. But what else happened? This money went into tax havens. This money was moved where you couldn't tax it. Greece felt that, but this is now a global problem. When people were talking to me about, oh, Greeks avoid taxes, I say, wait a minute. The whole financial system is rigged to help people move their money into tax havens or hide from taxes. Google, Apple, Amazon, they're all doing it.
Yeah, I mean, your point's well taken, which is that there's a competition for capital, and if your taxes are too high or your system isn't fair enough, it will leave. And that leaves governments short of funds.
Yes.
That I accept. But in a way, what I wanted to ask you, socialism, we call it socialism. Let's call it
social democracy.
Social democracy, which I think is much more accurate. But it was tremendous success of the last century.
Yes.
Right? It brought us trade unions. It brought us pensions. It put limits on workers' hours. It treated people with dignity. But you know, the slowdown in the economy and the changing demography and the competition for capital and the competition for workers and globalization, blah, 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 it has made it really difficult to pay for this wonderful social system that was created in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s of the last century. That, to me, is the center-left's problem. It's become very defensive. It's trying to protect these things that it won, but it can't afford it. And it can't tax too high because capital will flee. So
that is the conundrum. That is the problem.
What do you say?
Well, right. That's why I'm saying that when capital is fleeing, you can't tax it. But that then becomes more of a global problem. But this is where Europe could actually play a role. Europe could say, we actually are going to fight tax havens, or we are going to do certain types of taxes, such as the Tobin tax, as it's called, on transactions in capital, or possibly taxes on greenhouse emissions. This would also create revenues for investing in growth, in jobs, in green growth, in education, and in the social system. But this is where Europe as a whole has to work together, and we were splintered. And the conservatives were very much against anything like this. I remember bringing this up in 2009, not 2010. I said, we are in a financial crisis, we need stimulus, we can't do it at a national level, we can't do the Keynesian politics at the national level because it'll just mean maybe imports and not really real growth. In the end, we'll raise our debt. But we can do this at the European level, and we can affect the global world. As a matter of fact, what I say is Europe has an existential, we still are a very important peace project, and I think that's one reason why Greece remains one of the most positive, a Greek population positive towards the European project. And we are a project under construction still, but I believe that we need to look for a new vision for Europe. And this would be maybe humanizing globalization. Actually bringing in these social democratic values, the social contract. We need a global social contract. Maybe it should be around climate change. Maybe it should be around SDGs.
This is what I want, because there's another dilemma I wanted to ask you about, which is when you look at Macron, you wouldn't call him center-left. I don't know what you call him. You call him lucky. You know? And maybe he's not so lucky now,
right.
but you know, the system fell apart and he rolled up and became president of France. And there was a carbon tax, you know, a tax on gasoline that was designed to help the climate, right? Because we all care about the climate. We need to do something about the climate. And so who paid the penalty, of course, were the people who actually used cars, which sparked the Gilets jaunes movement. And you see it all over Europe. Climate has become an elitist issue. People are attacking it, right? It's become something that do-gooders care about, right? That academics care about. And yet there is a crisis. So how do you answer that if you're trying to, you know, attract working class voters and so on?
We actually had this in the Socialist International. One of the first things I had a commission, and we say there is actually a climate change apartheid. The upper class can escape environmental problems up to a point. We're all on the same planet unless they go to Mars. But the middle and working class are the ones that are hit more and more, and the poor in the world are hit more by climate change than anyone else. And that's why you see a shift even in the developing countries and the less developed countries in favor of the policies of climate change in the Paris summit. Secondly, you can't say, I lower the taxes for the rich, but then I'm going to tax the poor. But basically, that's what Macron did.
Yeah, exactly.
So you had to compensate in one way or other for those workers that have to use their cars, diesel cars or whatever, to go to work, and they don't have much margin to actually pay these taxes. But there's one other reason, I would say, which is a problem which all developed world face, as we have seen more of a deindustrialization, different types of forms of work. We have lost the organized voice of labor. A lot of it is migrant labor also, which is also disorganized or not really have any rights.
Sure.
So you have the Gilets jaunes, the yellow jackets that come out, and they are basically because they have no other voice. Had there been strong trade unions still, which were sort of by neoliberals fought all the time. I'm not saying that trade unions are always doing the right thing, but they were an organized voice. And where they are an organized voice and they sit down and work for compromises, they actually can bring along society.
Sure.
So you have this loss in France. Maybe there's another problem in France that it is a bit of an elitist politics. Huh? Not one politician does not come out of the not great, but they are not really.
And most of them haven't run businesses. But, you know, the whole French trade union thing is a whole big discussion, which we shouldn't have
It's a wider,
right now.
it's a wider. It's the same thing in the U.S. too.
Of
Trade
course.
unions have lost power.
No, absolutely.
And losing power means that an organized society isn't there. So that you have voices coming out disorganized or going through social media. A lot of it is anger. It's not really constructive. But slowly, we're also seeing that this younger generation, the millennial generation.
I want to ask you this. I mean, as you look at what's going on in the Democratic Party in the United States, which will have its civil war, and before it picks what sort of candidate it's going to have, I mean, there is a strong generational shift, it seems, to the left inside that party. And of course, you see it in Britain too, with momentum. So does this give you some sense of encouragement? Can it be shaped to real policies, do you think?
I think so, and I think this is a hopeful thing. And I'm, as head of the Socialist International, we see, first of all, that you may have problems in Europe, but I think there will be a resurgence of progressive ideas in politics. And that, I think, will be the counter to this Euroscepticism and this demagoguery. I don't call it populism so much as demagoguery, where what we see, in fact, is people sometimes in Europe say, okay, either you're pro-European or you're one of these Eurosceptics, demagogues. Well, there's another way. That's healthy criticism of Europe. You can be very much in favor of Europe, but say, and not against the values that Europe has represented, but also be critical that Europe is not moving in that direction even more. We need to keep the social contract. We need to be more aggressive on climate change. We can actually use it as an inspiration for the younger generation and for new investment. We could have borrowed, and we can still borrow and invest in all the climate change infrastructure, which will be very important for the future and make Europe maybe number one. I mean, maybe that's a bad thing, but it could be number one in climate, a good aspiration. And it wouldn't cost us that much because in the end that would be huge returns in a decarbonized future that we need. But this is, what I feel is, these are, I mean, it's not so difficult if we think that there's so much money that's hidden in tax havens. If we feel that there is such inequality and huge amounts of wealth, if we do work together, the progressive forces around the world, and say, listen, if you want the world to go to pieces, okay, then we just let this inequality grow. If you want a peaceful world where people don't go back to their little corners, their tribalism and so on, we need to make people feel safe and secure and give them hope and give them possibilities. The millennial generation is slowly organizing itself and is doing that even across borders, but certainly inside countries too. And their policies, I don't think, are unrealistic. If you talk about, you know, universal health care in the United States, that is not unrealistic. U.S. has the highest health bills in the whole world, but it has a lousy system, for a large part of the population.
That's
You don't need much more money. You need better organization and not to have these huge lobbies. And that's one of the problems we also have. Don't want to meander on this, but when you have such a concentration of wealth, that undermines our democracy. Politics is captured by big money, and it's done around the world. And I've seen it in Greece. And we had to fight the big pharmaceutical companies, and we had a lot of the banks and a lot of the, big media moguls and oil companies and so on, much more powerful than the politicians. So we have to make sure that democracy is really working.
And clientelism was a problem too.
And it still is.
But let's talk about Brussels for a second. The European Union, the Commission, right? Do you think it understands the threat to European Union cohesion coming from the challenge of, you can call it demagoguery, you can call it unhappiness, you could call it gilets jaunes, you can call it populism, but people who no longer feel that Europe is giving them what it promised, which is protection, economic growth, and a better life. Did they get it, or are they still kind of living in their own world?
Maybe it's difficult to sort of generalize the European Commission because they are individuals themselves and different people and so on. I think there is a wake-up call with Brexit, with the financial crisis, with the the refugee crisis, and the demagoguery that has accompanied a lot of this, that something has to be done. Europe could have dealt with the refugee crisis if we worked together. It would have been a much easier process than if we only had, let's say, some of the Mediterranean countries and some of the northern countries basically facing the brunt of the refugee crisis. Had we had a burden-sharing process, which the Commission actually proposed, this would have been a much simpler proposal, a much simpler issue. With the financial crisis also, had we worked together initially as Europe and not simply trying to find who's to blame or who's going to pay, we would have dealt with the markets much more efficiently. If we talk about issues like common defense, common issues around, let's say, unemployment training, the unemployed, have a common policy and a central one in Europe.
Even a common asylum policy would help.
Common asylum policy. These are issues, and if we had a much more robust, even though Europe has been in the forefront, but really pushing the issue of climate change and saying this is the new challenge for humanity, and Europe is stepping up to this, I think we would show that Europe can be cohesive and can deal. But this means the political will, and that's the problem. We have to speak out. We more progressives have to speak out. We have to fight against this demagoguery. We have to fight against those who say the solution is to go back to our little island, which is sort of Brexit. I mean, I love to go to my little Greek islands, and feel that I can get away from the world. But then we realize, if you just, go swimming, that you have the beautiful ruins of the ancient past, but they'll have the plastic bottles of the modern ruins, and then you'll have, the crisis in Syria bringing you refugees. We are not islands.
Let me ask you that, because it also brought an awful lot of orange life-saving vests, right? I mean, some people have compared, Ivan Krastyev, for instance, talking about Central Europe, compared the migration challenge to 1989 in the challenge it brought to these societies. Do you think part of the problem, part of the roots also of the anger is particularly Greece and Italy screwed again by a lack of solidarity from others on the migration question? I mean, you both still have lots and lots of refugees, asylum seekers, whatever you want to call them, and nobody seems to be terribly eager to take them off your hands.
Yeah, I think what was easy for a lot of these demagogues was to create fear. And you are basically seeing societies like Hungary where leaders like Orban are playing on this fear. I can't remember whether Slovakia, Slovenia, I think it was Slovakia that had in the recent elections, and the party that won, became number one, was an anti-migrant, anti-refugee, anti-migrant party. They took in 46 refugees. Now that is not going to change their identity. So there's a deep sense of fear. But I think it's combined with other issues of insecurity. Think of these Central and Eastern countries, and Greece has felt this also. We have a depopulation. We have some of the most vibrant, energetic citizens of our country leaving Greece. 400,000, 500,000 young people leaving Greece to find jobs somewhere else. That makes our society conservative. That means we lose their ideas, their innovation, their push for reform and change. And that also means that the people that are left behind feel much more insecure. So we have to understand that this is a complex issue. But again, the solution is not to close our borders. The solution is, can we manage this in a common and a unified way? And secondly, can we see how migrants and refugees can actually become a positive tool? Now that sounds, some people say that's nice words, but no, I was a refugee. My family was a refugee. My father was a refugee, my grandfather was a refugee, My great-grandfather was a refugee. Refugees and migrants are change agents. When I came back to Greece, came back to change, to fight for change. And those young people that will be coming back from Greece, those 400 or 500, hopefully many of them will come back to Greece, they will be change agents. They will say, we saw that things can be different, and we want something different in our country. So let's see that these migrants that are coming from Syria, at some point, they will go back to Syria and they will be change agents. And we owe it to the Middle East. We owe it to the Syrians, to the Iraqis, to all those places where the West has invaded also, that we need to see help them in reconstruct their countries.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many are going to be going back to Syria very soon.
Not immediately, but there will be. There will be, though.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Just 2 days ago, I was in The Hague meeting on the refugee issue and talking about Syria, and actually there are a lot of Syrian families that are saying, yes, if it stabilizes, we do want to go back. Not everybody will.
I promised to end on time, which means we've only got about 1 minute and a half left. But I did want to ask you, what do you think is the biggest challenge to Europe? What should be the biggest issue in these European elections?
Well, I would be inspired by what Alexandria Cortez is doing, the Green Deal, which is not just a climate issue. It's not just an issue around environment, but it's around the whole concept of rethinking our economy, decarbonizing the economy, but then investing in the new types of technologies, education, research to create, and infrastructure. And also at the same time, look at how this can be combined with social cohesion, going back to a new possible social contract, using technology. Technology is something that frightens people or excites people, but use it for the common good, and it's also seeing how all these policies can help the common good rather than simply, more profit and so on. So I think if Europe took that as a big issue, and we looked at this in a spirit of solidarity and understanding each other, we can create a European consciousness, and I believe Greece can be at the forefront. We have a lot of possibilities in green development. We could develop all our islands. We could do, an agro-food, and I think Greece could be one of the forerunners in this new type of Europe that we would have.
Right. George, unfortunately, I wish we had more time, but we don't, so thank you
very
much.
Steve. Thank you. Thank you.